I am Leo Sterling, 28 years old. 6 weeks ago, while I was still actively drowning in the grief of losing my grandfather, my parents and my older brother showed up at my front door with a team of security guards to literally drag me out of my own home and steal my inheritance. While I was standing there, trying to process the horrific car crash that had just taken the only person who ever loved me, my own father looked me dead in the eye and said, "You are a penniless, worthless music teacher. Give us the money, or you are dead to this family." They laughed at me in front of their high-priced corporate lawyers, expecting me to just crumble and hand over a $7 billion empire because I had always been the quiet, obedient, invisible disappointment of the family. But there was one thing they didn't know. My grandfather had spent years silently preparing a legal and financial fortress around me. And the people standing in the shadows behind me that morning weren't just the house staff. And now, the very family that threw me out onto the street in the middle of the night is begging for mercy while facing severe, inescapable legal consequences. Before I tell you exactly what happened and how I brought a billionaire dynasty to its knees, hit the like button if you truly believe in justice. And don't forget to let me know exactly where you are watching from in the comments below. Your support means everything. Now let's go back to where this nightmare really began. I stood completely still in the grand, cavernous foyer of my grandfather's estate. My hands were shoved deep into the pockets of my cheap, worn-out winter coat, my fingers tightly gripping the cold, heavy brass key he had given me a year ago. Through the towering, custom-made stained glass windows that flanked the massive oak front doors, I could see them pulling up to the iron gates. The headlights of my father's pristine black Ferrari and my brother Julian's obnoxious silver Porsche cut aggressively through the morning fog, the tires crunching violently over the imported gravel driveway. They were here to evict me. They had actually brought private security contractors, large men in dark suits, expecting a physical altercation. They fully intended to throw me out onto the concrete just like they had done less than 24 hours earlier at their own house. The heavy oak doors suddenly rattled under the sheer, brutal force of my father's fists. The sound echoed through the high ceilings of the mansion like cannon fire. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I just stood there, letting the heavy thuds ring through the quiet house, feeling the vibrations in the marble floor beneath my cheap boots. My heart was pounding furiously against my ribs, an erratic drumbeat of adrenaline and residual fear. But my mind was incredibly, strangely clear. How did a public school music teacher, a guy who budgeted his grocery shopping down to the exact dollar to afford rent, end up barricaded inside a billionaire's fortified mansion, waiting to wage a full-scale corporate and legal war against his own flesh and blood? To understand that moment, you have to understand the miserable, shadowed life I led long before that brass key was ever pressed into my palm. For as long as I can recall, I was the resident ghost of the Sterling family. I was the stain on a pristine legacy. My father, Arthur Sterling, is a ruthless, predatory corporate CEO who treats our family tree exactly like a corporate ladder. If you weren't producing a high financial yield, if you weren't expanding his influence, you were a liability that needed to be written off. My mother, Eleanor, lived for the country club, the exclusive HOA meetings, the charity galas where she could wear $50,000 necklaces, and the sheer, blinding prestige of the Sterling name. She was a woman constructed entirely of designer labels and cold judgment. And then there was Julian, my older brother, the undisputed golden child. Julian was 32, incredibly handsome, fiercely arrogant, and ran a flashy tech startup in Silicon Valley that produced absolutely nothing of actual value. But he knew how to talk. He knew how to leverage our father's connections, and he spent his weekends burning through the family wealth on yachts, VIP tables, and reckless investments. And me? I was just Leo. I taught music to middle schoolers in a cramped, poorly ventilated classroom in the downtown public school district. My days were filled with the smell of old rosin, cheap floor wax, and the screeching sounds of 12-year-olds destroying Mozart. My miserable salary barely covered my monthly rent for a studio apartment, my basic groceries, and the gas I put into a 2012 Honda Civic that violently rattled every time the speedometer hit 60. I didn't have a massive 401k. I didn't have a trust fund. I didn't even have a savings account that could survive a medical emergency. But the truth was I was happy. I found genuine beauty in the small things. I loved the exact moment a struggling kid finally nailed a difficult piano scale, their eyes lighting up with pride. I loved coming home to my quiet apartment, brewing a cheap cup of coffee, and writing my own sheet music until my neighbor banged on the ceiling with a broom. My parents, however, viewed my happiness as a personal insult. I remember a very specific Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago. It's burned into my memory. We were sitting around my parents' massive, custom-made mahogany dining table. The crystal glasses gleamed under the chandelier. Julian was loudly bragging about his latest commercial real estate venture, deliberately flashing a platinum watch that cost more than my entire annual income. My mother was nodding along, practically glowing with maternal pride, pouring him another glass of $300 wine. I reached silently for the bowl of mashed potatoes. My father stopped his conversation, his eyes locking onto me like a sniper. The entire table went dead silent. "So, Leo?" Arthur sneered, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal Scotch glass. "When are you going to stop playing nursery rhymes and get a real job? The board members are starting to ask why my youngest son is living like a welfare recipient. It's embarrassing." Julian immediately chimed in, letting out a loud, mocking laugh. "Don't push him, Dad. Somebody has to teach the tone-deaf kids how to bang on a tambourine. Besides, he'll probably be paying off his state college student loans until he's 70. Let the peasant have his potatoes." They all laughed. A cold, cruel, unified family laugh. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, carefully chewing my food, staring down at my plate, feeling completely and utterly invisible. I swallowed the humiliation because fighting back only ever made the punishments worse. The only person on this entire earth who never looked at me like I was a bad investment was my grandfather, Winston Sterling. He was the patriarch. He built the entire multi-billion-dollar empire from the ground up, starting with a single logistics warehouse in the 70s. But you would absolutely never know he was a billionaire by looking at him. While my parents obsessed over European sports cars, my grandfather drove the exact same black Lincoln sedan for 15 years. He wore meticulously tailored suits, but they were older than I was. He didn't care about impressing anyone. He was my ultimate sanctuary. I spent almost every Sunday afternoon of my childhood at his estate. We would sit side by side on the bench of his antique Steinway grand piano. His fingers, though wrinkled and slightly stiff with age, moved across the ivory keys with a terrifying, breathtaking grace. He used to lean down, bump his shoulder against mine, and whisper, "Leo, listen to me. Money will buy you the finest piano in the world. It will buy you the concert hall. But it can never, ever buy you the music. That comes from here." He would tap a heavy finger right over my heart. "Never let them buy your soul, my boy." He was preparing me. I just didn't know it yet. And then came the Tuesday night that shattered my entire world into a million jagged pieces. It was raining. I was sitting at my cheap Formica kitchen table, hunched over a stack of theory papers, my red pen bleeding ink onto the pages. The apartment was dead quiet except for the hum of my ancient refrigerator. When my cell phone vibrated against the table, flashing an unknown number, a cold spike of dread hit the base of my neck. I answered it. "Leo Sterling?" A heavy, deeply official voice asked through the speaker. "This is Officer Daniels with the State Highway Patrol. I'm very sorry to inform you that your grandfather, Winston Sterling, was involved in a major collision tonight." My breath hitched. "Is he? Which hospital?" I stammered, already grabbing my car keys. "I'm sorry, son," the officer said gently. A drunk driver crossed the center divide at 80 miles an hour. His vehicle was struck head-on. He didn't make it. The world instantly dissolved. My fingers went completely numb. The plastic phone slipped from my grasp, hitting the linoleum floor with a sharp, sickening crack that shattered the screen. Couldn't breathe. My chest tightened so violently I thought my ribs were breaking. "Didn't make it." The words looped in my brain like a broken record. My grandfather wasn't just alive. He was a force of nature. He was supposed to come to my school's winter recital next month. He was the only tether I had to feeling human. I sank slowly to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, and I wept in the dark until my throat literally bled. I was utterly shattered, completely unaware that the worst nightmare of my life was already waiting for me at the funeral. The funeral was an absolute sickening circus. If you have never had the extreme misfortune of attending a billionaire's funeral, let me paint the horrific picture for you. It was not a sanctuary for mourning. It was a high-stakes, heavily calculated networking event wrapped in black designer clothing. The service was held at the largest cathedral in the city. The street outside was entirely blocked off by a fleet of black SUVs and a swarm of local press photographers trying to get shots of the city's elite. Inside, the air was thick with the suffocating smell of hundreds of white lilies and expensive imported perfumes. I stood near the front, just a few feet away from the polished mahogany casket, my eyes burning from exhaustion and unshed tears. I stared down at the man who had basically raised me. He looked so incredibly peaceful, his hands folded neatly over his chest, dressed in his favorite navy blue suit. But the atmosphere in the cavernous room was anything but peaceful. It was vibrating with greed. My mother, Eleanor, was fluttering around the front pews like a social butterfly at a gala. She was aggressively adjusting her heavy pearl necklace and loudly complaining to a group of country club wives. "Can you honestly believe Winston insisted on driving himself at his age?" she whispered loudly, not caring who heard her. A billionaire, and he insisted on acting like a commoner. If he had just paid for a private chauffeur like Arthur told him to, we wouldn't be dealing with this massive inconvenience right before the holiday season. She said this literally 10 feet away from his lifeless body. I gripped the edge of the wooden podium so hard my fingernails dug into the varnish. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the pews and throw them all out into the rain. My father was even worse. Arthur didn't shed a single solitary tear. He stood stiffly near the side entrance, his jaw permanently clenched, his sharp eyes constantly darting around the room, taking inventory of the politicians and CEOs who had shown up. He wasn't grieving the loss of his father. He was doing aggressive mental math. I could physically see the calculations running behind his cold eyes: real estate holdings, stock portfolios, corporate voting rights, offshore accounts. He was already planning his absolute coronation as the unquestioned head of the sterling corporate empire. And Julian? Julian was leaning against a marble pillar near the back, hiding behind his dark sunglasses, aggressively scrolling through his phone. He looked deeply, physically inconvenienced by the entire affair. When I finally couldn't take the silence anymore, I walked up to him. "Julian," I said softly, "are you holding up okay?" He didn't even bother to look up from his screen. He just let out a heavy sigh, shifting his weight. "Honestly, Leo, I'll be a lot better once the lawyers finish the paperwork and we figure out exactly what we're getting. My investors are breathing down my neck. This whole mourning period is killing my quarterly projections." I felt physically sick. A wave of nausea washed over me, so strong I had to brace myself against the wall. I turned away from my own brother, walked back to the casket, and placed my hand gently on the polished wood. I leaned in close, whispering a desperate promise to my grandfather. "I will make you proud, Grandpa," I choked out, tears finally breaking free and spilling down my cheeks. "I promise I won't let them erase who you were." Later that afternoon, after the crowds had finally thinned out and the catering staff was cleaning up the untouched hors d'oeuvres, my Aunt Beatrice cornered me in the hallway. Aunt Beatrice was my father's younger sister. She was a woman who always played the role of the sweet, caring, maternal peacemaker. She handed me a cup of lukewarm coffee, her heavy gold bracelets clinking together as she patted my arm with a deeply sympathetic, practiced smile. "Oh, Leo, my sweet, sweet boy," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial honey. "This is so incredibly hard on all of us. Such a tragedy. But, we have to look to the future now. Arthur is going to be under a massive amount of stress taking over the corporation. Julian is going to need a lot of the liquid capital to keep his tech business afloat. I hope you won't cause any unnecessary friction, dear. Let's just keep the peace, shall we? You have your little teaching job, and I'm sure your father will set up a nice little trust fund for you. Nothing crazy, just enough to help with rent. Just don't get in their way when the will is read. Okay. I stared at her, the lukewarm coffee burning my hands. The psychological manipulation was so incredibly smooth, so perfectly practiced. She was already attempting to sideline me, planting the seed that I shouldn't dare ask for a single dime of what was left behind. She wanted me docile and submissive. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed with her toxic lies, but because in that exact moment, a terrifying realization hit me. I was entirely surrounded by vultures. Every single member of my family was just circling in the sky, waiting for the carcass to cool down enough so they could rip it apart. 2 agonizing, silent weeks passed. 2 weeks of absolute radio silence from my parents. There were no phone calls to check on my mental health, no invitations to dinner to mourn as a family. Nothing. I dragged myself back to my public school classroom, forcing myself to play scales with 12-year-olds, trying to desperately numb the crushing weight of grief. The silence in my apartment at night was deafening. Then, exactly 14 days after the funeral, the phone call came. It was Victor Vance, my grandfather's personal attorney and his closest, most trusted confidant. Victor was a shark in a tailored suit, but he had always been kind to me. Today, however, his voice was incredibly formal, completely devoid of the warmth he usually showed me when he visited the estate for scotch and cigars. "Leo," Victor said, his tone heavy and uncompromising. "The legal proceedings are ready. Your grandfather's last will and testament is prepared for execution. He explicitly requested your presence, along with your parents and your brother, tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. In my office." A cold, heavy dread settled deep in the pit of my stomach. I didn't care about the money. I honestly assumed my grandfather had left me a small, sentimental sum. Maybe $50,000 to pay off my state college student loans, or enough to put a modest down payment on a house in the suburbs. I fully expected the entire multi-billion-dollar empire to inevitably flow right into my father's greedy hands. But Victor's dark, serious tone suggested something much heavier was coming. "I'll be there, Victor," I replied, my voice shaking slightly. "Be prepared, Leo," he warned quietly before hanging up. The next morning, the sky was a bruised, heavy gray, threatening rain. I walked into Victor's downtown law firm. The building was an old, converted Victorian mansion, entirely out of place among the modern glass skyscrapers. The air inside smelled deeply of rich leather, old paper, and ancient money. I was wearing my only decent suit, a cheap, off-the-rack navy blazer that felt painfully inadequate the second my family swept into the waiting room. My father arrived like a hurricane, aggressively adjusting his gold Rolex with a sharp snap of his wrist. My mother's designer heels clicked like gunshots against the hardwood floor, her chin held impossibly high. Julian slouched in behind them, wearing expensive sunglasses indoors, looking profoundly bored. "Let's get this circus over with," my father barked at the receptionist, not even acknowledging my presence in the corner. "We all know how this goes. My father built the empire, and as his only capable son, I'll be taking the helm. Tell Victor to hurry up." Victor's assistant silently led us into a massive, glass-walled conference room. A long, intimidating oak table dominated the space. My parents immediately marched to the head of the table, claiming the seats of power as if they already owned the building. Julian threw himself into a chair, carelessly propping his expensive leather sneakers up on the edge of the polished wood. I sat quietly in the far corner, as far away from them as possible, keeping my head down. Victor Vance walked into the room. He didn't smile. He sat down at the opposite end of the table, meticulously adjusted his reading glasses, and opened a thick, incredibly intimidating leather-bound folder. He looked directly at my father, then shifted his gaze to Julian, and finally, his sharp eyes locked onto mine. The room went completely terrifyingly silent. The storm was about to break, and absolutely none of us were prepared for the sheer, catastrophic devastation it was going to cause. Winston Sterling was of completely sound mind and body when he updated this will exactly 6 months ago. Victor began, his voice cutting through the thick tension in the room like a scalpel. He underwent extensive cognitive evaluations by 3 independent medical professionals. I was personally present for every single signature. There is absolutely no question regarding his legal capacity. My father waved a dismissive hand in the air, leaning back in his chair. Yes, we know. The old man was sharp as a tack until the very end. Stop stalling with the legal disclaimers and just read the document, Victor. I have a board meeting at noon. Victor stared at my father for a long, uncomfortable second. Then, he cleared his throat and looked down at the heavy parchment paper. I, Winston Sterling, being of sound mind, do hereby declare this document to be my last will and testament. Victor read, his voice booming slightly in the acoustics of the glass room. To my beloved grandson, Leo Sterling, I leave the entirety of my estate. This includes all liquid financial assets, all real estate properties, all international stock holdings, and the full, unquestioned controlling interest in the Sterling Corporation. The total valuation of this inheritance is approximately $7 billion. The words hung in the air. $7 billion. To me, for 5 agonizing, suffocating seconds, no one in the room even breathed. The silence was so absolute I could hear the ticking of Victor's wristwatch. I completely froze in my chair, my heart stopping in my chest. I was absolutely certain I had misheard the man. 7 billion? Me? The music teacher who buys generic brand cereal? Then the room exploded like a bomb going off. What? My father launched out of his leather chair so violently it tipped over and crashed backward onto the hardwood floor. His face flushed a dangerous, mottled shade of crimson, the veins in his neck bulging as if they were about to burst. That is a lie. That is a fabricated, fraudulent document. My father would never, ever bypass me. I am the CEO. My mother grabbed the edge of the oak table, her knuckles turning bone white, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical screech. $7 billion to a nobody music teacher. Are you insane, Victor? He doesn't know the first thing about corporate finance. He doesn't even own a house. He drives a piece of trash car. He will ruin us. Julian ripped his designer sunglasses off his face and slammed both of his fists onto the table, shaking the water glasses. Where the hell is my cut? I need that capital for my startup. I have venture capitalists breathing down my neck. He promised me financial backing. This is a joke. Victor didn't even blink. He raised a hand, his face completely impassive, radiating pure legal authority. Mr. Sterling anticipated this exact reaction. He made it explicitly clear that his decision was heavily intentional. He left a video statement to clarify his intent. Victor reached for a small remote on the table and pressed a button. A large, high-definition screen mounted on the far wall flickered to life. And suddenly, there he was. My grandfather. He was sitting in his favorite worn leather armchair at the estate, his hands folded neatly in his lap, looking straight into the camera with piercing, undeniable clarity. Arthur, Eleanor, Julian. My grandfather's recorded voice echoed through the chaotic room, instantly silencing my family. If you are watching this, it means I have passed on. I love you, because you are my blood. But I can no longer ignore the absolute poison you have let money become in your lives. Arthur, your greed has blinded you. You view this family as a transaction. Eleanor, you care more about your social standing than your own children. Julian, you are reckless, entitled, and severely compromised. The video paused for a heartbeat, and my grandfather's eyes seemed to search the room until they found me. His expression softened entirely. Leo is different. He visits me because he actually cares, not because he wants a check. He lives his life with integrity. He understands the value of a single dollar, and more importantly, the value of a human soul. He will carry my legacy with dignity. Do not test him. The screen went black. My father was physically shaking with a rage so pure it was terrifying. "This is psychological manipulation," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You got into his head, Leo. You whispered in his ear while he was old and confused. You poisoned him against his own son." "Actually, Arthur," Victor interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, turning ice-cold and razor-sharp. "Your father knew exactly what he was doing, particularly regarding your golden boy, Julian." Victor calmly pulled another thick, red-tabbed file from his leather briefcase and slid it across the long table until it stopped directly in front of my brother. "Winston conducted a private, highly classified forensic audit of your startup 6 months ago, Julian," Victor stated, his eyes locking onto my brother's panicked face. "He knew all about the fabricated revenue numbers you showed your investors. He knew about the offshore accounts in the Caymans. He knew that you are currently $12 million in debt to some very unpleasant, unregulated creditors due to your illegal business practices. He left you absolutely nothing because he refused to let the sterling legacy pay for your felonies." Julian went completely pale. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He slowly backed away from the table, his mouth opening and closing without sound. My father looked at Julian's terrified face, realizing the truth instantly. But instead of turning his anger on his criminal son, Arthur turned back to me, his eyes wide with a manic, desperate fury. "This isn't over," Arthur hissed, stepping around the table, looming over me with physical intimidation. "You think you can just walk in here, play the innocent victim, and steal my birthright? You're going to regret this, Leo. I will crush you." That evening, I was sitting in my apartment, staring at the wall, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my father. "Come to the house. 8 p.m. We are settling this tonight." There was no question mark. It was a direct, militaristic order. Part of me was absolutely terrified. My stomach was in knots. But a deeper, stronger part of me, the part my grandfather had nurtured, needed to see exactly how far they were willing to go to destroy me. When I walked into their sprawling mansion, it looked like a corporate boardroom preparing for a hostile takeover. My father was pacing violently by the massive stone fireplace, a heavy tumbler of scotch in his hand. My mother was perched rigidly on the edge of a designer sofa, her eyes cold and sharp as daggers. Julian was sprawled across a chair, a laptop open, typing furiously, sweat gleaming on his forehead. "Sit," my father commanded, pointing to a single chair in the center of the room. I didn't sit. I stood my ground near the doorway, my arms crossed over my chest. "Say what you need to say, Arthur." My father's jaw twitched at the use of his first name, but he kept his voice dangerously calm. "We are going to fix this massive mistake tonight. You are going to sign a legal transfer of the estate over to me. I will manage the corporation properly. In exchange, I will grant you a generous, irrevocable allowance. 10%. That's $700 million. That is more money than a pathetic public school teacher like you could spend in 10 lifetimes. You take the money, and you walk away." I stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of his demand wash over me. "You want me to surrender Grandpa's final dying wish? You want me to hand over the keys to the empire to the exact people he was trying to protect it from?" "Don't be a selfish brat, Leo," Julian suddenly snapped, slamming his laptop shut so hard the plastic cracked. $700 million is plenty for you to play your little piano. I need the rest of that liquid capital to save my company before those creditors break my legs. Stop playing the victim and sign the damn papers." "Selfish," I repeated, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I took a step forward. "Grandpa chose me because I didn't look at him like an ATM. He chose me because he knew, deep down, that you would destroy everything he spent 50 years building. You didn't love him. You loved his bank accounts." My father slammed his scotch glass down on the mantel, the crystal shattering into pieces. He closed the distance between us in 3 massive strides, towering over me, his breath reeking of alcohol. "This isn't about choice, Leo. This is about family loyalty. You sign those papers right now, or you walk out that front door with absolutely nothing. Let me make this perfectly clear. If you leave this house tonight without signing, you are no longer my son. You are dead to us. Do not call when you are starving. Do not come back. I will use every lawyer I know to bury you in litigation until you are bankrupt. The silence in the grand living room was deafening. My own parents were demanding I sell my soul, demanding I betray the only man who truly loved me, for the cheap price of their toxic acceptance. I looked over at my mother, desperately hoping to see a shred of maternal instinct. She just glared at me, her face a mask of Botox and hatred. Money won't keep you warm at night, Leo. Family is forever. I let out a harsh, dry laugh that scraped against my throat. If family is forever, Eleanor, then why are you throwing me away like garbage right now? I turned my back on them and walked out the door. Behind me, my father screamed that I was a dead man. The heavy front door slammed shut, the sound echoing sharply in the freezing night air. I was completely alone, officially disowned, and effectively homeless. But as I walked to my beat-up car, I reached into my pocket and gripped the cold brass key my grandfather had given me. I wasn't just walking away from them. I was walking directly toward the war. I drove aimlessly through the dark, winding roads for an hour, my old Honda Civic struggling as it climbed the steep hills toward the wealthy, secluded outskirts of the city. The heater in the car was broken, and the freezing night air seeped through the vents, chilling me to the bone. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned completely white and my wrists ached. I had absolutely nowhere else to go. My lease on my tiny apartment was up in 2 days, and my father had explicitly told me I was dead to them. I knew he meant it. If I went back to my apartment, Arthur would have his lawyers freeze my meager bank accounts by morning just out of spite. When the massive, wrought-iron gates of the Sterling estate finally loomed in the headlights, a heavy, suffocating knot formed in my stomach. The gates stood like silent, intimidating sentinels in the fog. I pulled the car up to the glowing security keypad. With a violently trembling hand, I rolled down the window and inserted the heavy brass key into the manual override slot. The machinery groaned, a deep, mechanical hum, and the massive gates slowly swung open, welcoming me in. I drove up the long, winding gravel driveway, flanked by ancient oak trees that looked like they were bowing in the dark. I parked my beat-up Civic directly in front of the circular driveway, the cheap car looking absurdly out of place against the backdrop of the multi-million-dollar mansion. I grabbed my single duffel bag from the passenger seat and walked up the grand stone steps. When I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the massive foyer, the familiar scent of lemon polish, old books, and rich cedarwood hit me like a physical blow. It smelled exactly like my childhood. It smelled like safety. It smelled like him. Mr. Leo. I jumped, dropping my duffel bag with a heavy thud. Stepping quietly out of the shadows near the grand staircase was Thomas, the head butler who had managed the estate and my grandfather's life for over 30 years. He looked older than I remembered, deeply tired, but his eyes were incredibly sharp and fully alert. "Thomas?" I breathed out, the overwhelming tension suddenly leaving my shoulders. I thought everyone would be gone. I thought the staff was dismissed. "Your grandfather anticipated severe trouble from your father," Thomas said smoothly, walking over to effortlessly pick up my heavy bag. "He left us with highly explicit instructions. If anything happened to him, this house was to immediately go into a full security lockdown to protect you. You are the true heir of this family, sir. The entire staff is with you. We have been waiting for you." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes. My grandfather was always 5 steps ahead of everyone else. The next morning, the mansion felt entirely different. It wasn't just a house of mourning anymore. It had been transformed overnight into a heavily fortified command center. I walked into the massive, wood-paneled study to find a literal war council waiting for me. Victor Vance was already there, aggressively spreading complex legal documents across the mahogany desk. Next to him stood Sarah, the family's head chef and housekeeper, clutching a small, heavily worn wooden box to her chest. Standing confidently by the window was Elena Rostova, the brilliant, ruthless chief operating officer of the Sterling Corporation. And finally, Philip, my grandfather's intensely strict, deeply paranoid wealth manager, was booting up a highly encrypted laptop. "Good morning, Leo," Victor said, his tone all business, gesturing for me to sit at the heavy leather chair at the head of the desk. "We have a massive amount of ground to cover before your father officially makes his move to dethrone you." Elena stepped forward, dropping a thick, color-coded binder onto the desk with a heavy thud. "Your grandfather briefed me on this exact contingency months ago, Leo. The corporation's main assets are currently secure, but Arthur will absolutely attempt a hostile takeover using his cronies on the board of directors. He will try to freeze your access to the capital. I have already initiated the defensive financial protocols. You are the majority shareholder now. We are going to bleed his influence dry vote by vote." Sarah stepped up next, her hands trembling slightly as she handed me the wooden box. Her eyes were wet with unshed tears. "Your grandfather asked me to keep these hidden in the pantry safe. They are your grandmother's personal journals. She meticulously documented every single time Arthur came begging for a bailout, every time Julian stole antiques from the estate to pay his debts, and every time you came over just to sit and read to them when they were sick. It is the undeniable, handwritten proof of character that any judge will need to throw out Arthur's inevitable lawsuit." I felt a massive lump form in my throat. I traced the worn leather of the journals. My grandfather had known this catastrophic day would come. He had built an impenetrable wall of incredibly capable, fiercely loyal people around me to ensure I wouldn't fall when the wolves attacked. But that fleeting feeling of absolute security was violently shattered less than an hour later. My phone, sitting on the edge of the mahogany desk, buzzed loudly. It was a text message from an unknown number. I opened it. It was a screenshot of a bank transfer showing a deposit of $10,000. Below the image was a text. "Julian knows you're hiding at the estate. He paid me 10 grand for your daily teaching schedule, your apartment keys, and the security gate codes you gave me last year in case of emergencies. Sorry, Leo, but I have a mortgage to pay. It's just business." I stared at the glowing screen, my blood running completely cold. The text was from Derek. Derek was the other music teacher at my middle school. We ate lunch together in the break room every single day. I had bought him a beer literally 3 days ago to celebrate his birthday. We had complained about our low salaries together. And yet, Julian had reached out to my only actual friend and bought his absolute loyalty for a measly $10,000. A dark, freezing realization washed over my entire body. This was the horrifying reality of $7 billion. Corrupted absolutely everything it touched. It turned blood relatives into venomous predators and best friends into cheap corporate spies. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my phone against the wall like a child. I just stared at the message, deleted the contact, blocked the number, and set the phone face down on the desk. I looked up at Victor, Elena, and Thomas. The last shred of the naive, quiet, easily bullied music teacher burned away in that exact moment. My heart hardened into stone. "Thomas," I said, my voice completely steady, devoid of any emotion, "change every single gate code on the property immediately. Lock down the perimeter. Call the private security firm and double the guard detail. They are coming for us." And I was absolutely right, because the real storm, the final, explosive confrontation, was just about to hit the front door. The morning of the final confrontation broke with a heavy, suffocating blanket of gray fog rolling over the hills of the estate. The air outside was freezing, the kind of damp, biting cold that seeps directly into your bones. Inside the mansion, however, the atmosphere was electric. We were not just waiting, we were holding the line. I stood in the center of the massive marble foyer, staring at the towering oak front doors. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, echoing through the cavernous space like a heartbeat. Every single tick was a countdown to the exact moment my family would attempt to rip my life apart. Thomas had intentionally left the main iron gates at the bottom of the driveway unlocked. We knew they were coming. We wanted them to walk directly into the center of the web. Through the frosted side windows, I saw the headlights first. They pierced through the thick morning fog like predatory eyes. My father's black Ferrari roared up the circular driveway, the engine revving unnecessarily loud, an obnoxious display of wealth and dominance. Right behind him was Julian's silver Porsche, the tires violently spitting gravel as he slammed on the brakes. My mother's luxury SUV pulled up last, driven by a private security contractor. They had arrived like an invading army, fully expecting to conquer an empty, undefended castle. The heavy brass knocker on the front door slammed against the wood. Once, twice, 3 times. The sheer violence of the knocking rattled the stained glass in the frames. "Open this door, Leo!" My father's voice bellowed from the porch, muffled but unmistakable. "I know you are hiding in there. Open the damn door before I have my men break it off its hinges." I took a deep, steadying breath. I looked over my shoulder. Victor Vance, Elena Rostova, and a few others were positioned perfectly in the shadows of the adjacent formal living room, completely out of sight from the front entrance. Thomas stood rigidly by the grand staircase, his hands clasped behind his back, looking like a stone sentinel. I gave Thomas a single, brief nod. Thomas stepped forward, his leather shoes completely silent on the marble, and smoothly unbolted the heavy deadlocks. He pulled the massive doors wide open. The freezing wind rushed into the foyer, bringing my family with it. My father, Arthur, stormed over the threshold first. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit, his face flushed a dark, angry red. He looked around the grand foyer as if he already held the deed to the property. My mother, Eleanor, followed closely behind him, wrapping a heavily priced mink coat tightly around her shoulders, her nose wrinkled in absolute disdain. Julian swaggered in last, holding a thick manila folder, a vicious, triumphant smirk plastered across his face. And trailing just behind them, clutching a designer handbag, was Aunt Beatrice, wearing her signature mask of fake, maternal concern. Well, Arthur sneered, stepping right into my personal space. He looked me up and down, taking in my cheap jeans and worn-out sweater. "Look at the little music teacher trying to play Lord of the Manor. Did you honestly think changing the gate codes would stop me? I own the security firm that installed them. You are completely out of your depth, Leo." I didn't move an inch. I kept my hands in my pockets, my expression entirely blank. "This is private property, Arthur. You are trespassing." My mother let out a shrill, mocking laugh that echoed terribly against the high ceilings. "Private property? Oh, please, Leo, stop embarrassing yourself. This house belongs to the Sterling family. You are a footnote in this family. You don't have the funds to maintain the landscaping on this estate for a week, let alone pay the property taxes. Look at you. You look like a homeless person who wandered in off the street." Julian stepped forward, aggressively tapping the manila folder against his palm. "It's over, Leo. The little game of hide-and-seek is officially done. I told you I needed that capital, and you thought you could just lock the doors and hide. I have a buddy on the board of your bank. He's already filing the paperwork to freeze every single account associated with the estate pending our massive legal dispute. You won't be able to buy a cup of coffee by noon today." Julian leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a taunting whisper. "And by the way, Derek says hello. 10 grand was all it took for your best buddy to hand over everything I needed to know about your pathetic little life. You have no friends. You have no money. You have absolutely nothing." The sheer complacency radiating from them was staggering. They were so incredibly confident in their victory. They had spent their entire lives using money as a weapon to bludgeon people into submission, and they fully expected me to fall to my knees and beg for mercy. They thought my silence was fear. They didn't realize it was the calm before the execution. Aunt Beatrice stepped out from behind my mother, putting on her best, most sickeningly sweet face. She reached out, trying to touch my arm. "Leo, sweetheart, please listen to your father. This is getting incredibly ugly. We don't want to see you ruined in a courtroom. Just sign the transfer papers. Arthur is willing to give you a small stipend. You can go back to your quiet little life, teaching your students, and we can put all this terrible nastiness behind us. We are family, after all. You don't want to destroy our family, do you? I looked at Beatrice, then at my mother, then at Julian, and finally, my eyes locked onto my father's furious glare. I felt my heart slow down. The fear that had controlled my entire childhood was entirely gone, completely evaporated. You want me to sign the papers? I asked, my voice calm, smooth, and echoing clearly in the large space. Right now, Arthur commanded, snapping his fingers at Julian, who immediately pulled a thick stack of legal documents and a luxury fountain pen from the folder. Sign the rights to the corporation, the liquid assets, and the real estate over to me. You get a check for $1 million and you walk out that door. If you refuse, my security team will physically remove you from the premises, and my legal team will ensure you spend the next 10 years in federal court until you are completely bankrupt. My father practically shoved the documents into my chest. Sign it, Leo. Stop pretending you are something you are not. I took the documents from his hand. I looked down at the crisp white paper, the heavy black ink demanding the surrender of my grandfather's entire life's work. I held the papers for a long moment, letting the silence stretch out, letting them completely gorge themselves on their perceived victory. My father crossed his arms, a smug smile finally breaking through his anger. Julian chuckled under his breath. They thought they had won. Then, very calmly, very deliberately, I gripped the top of the documents. I ripped the thick stack of papers perfectly in half. The sound of the tearing paper was incredibly loud in the quiet foyer. My father's smug smile instantly vanished. Julian's jaw dropped. My mother gasped, clutching her pearls. I let the torn pieces of paper flutter to the marble floor, scattering over my father's polished shoes. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, looking my father directly in the eyes without a single shred of fear. I am not pretending anything, Arthur, I said, my voice vibrating with an icy authority I didn't know I possessed. I am the majority shareholder of the Sterling Corporation. I am the sole, legal owner of this estate. And you are standing in my house. My father's face contorted into absolute rage. He raised his hand, balling it into a fist, stepping forward to strike me. You ungrateful little bastard, I will. I highly suggest you lower your hand, Arthur, unless you want to add felony assault to your rapidly growing list of criminal charges. The voice did not come from me. It came from the shadows of the living room. The trap was finally sprung. Victor Vance stepped out of the shadows, the heels of his leather shoes clicking sharply on the marble. He was holding a sleek black tablet in his hands. But he was not alone. Following closely behind the lawyer was a tall, incredibly imposing man with silver hair, wearing a sharp navy suit. It was Judge David Maxwell, the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, and my grandfather's oldest, dearest friend. And stepping out right behind the judge, wearing a full-dress uniform with heavy brass badges gleaming on his chest, was Police Chief Reynolds, flanked by two heavily armed uniformed officers. The absolute mind-numbing shock that washed over my family's faces was something I will remember for the rest of my life. The color completely drained from my father's face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. My mother stumbled backward, physically tripping over the hem of her mink coat. Julian dropped his luxury pen on the floor, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door as if calculating whether he could run. Victor? My father stammered, his voice suddenly weak, his corporate bravado shattering instantly. David? What is the meaning of this? This is a private family matter. There is absolutely nothing private about this, Arthur, Judge Maxwell said, his voice booming with the heavy, terrifying weight of the law. Winston asked me personally to oversee the execution of his final will to ensure you didn't attempt exactly what you are doing right now. The documents you just tried to force your son to sign are legally classified as extortion. The will is ironclad. It is bulletproof. Leo is the sole heir. You have zero claim. None. But the corporation, Julian squeaked, his voice cracking. I have board members ready to freeze the accounts. Elena Rostova stepped into the light, her face a mask of ruthless corporate efficiency. Actually, Julian, you don't. I held an emergency board meeting at 6 o'clock this morning. When I presented the financial forensics proving you embezzled funds from your own startup and attempted to bribe a public school teacher to acquire the gate codes to this estate, the board voted unanimously to completely sever all ties with you and your father. Your accounts aren't frozen, Julian. They are empty. And Arthur, as of 2 hours ago, you are permanently removed from your position as CEO. Arthur looked like he had been physically shot in the chest. He staggered backward, grasping the edge of a marble table to keep himself from collapsing. You can't do that. I built the modern infrastructure of that company. I am a sterling. You are a liability, Elena replied coldly. Aunt Beatrice, realizing the ship was rapidly sinking, immediately tried to switch sides. She clasped her hands together, tears welling up in her eyes as she looked at me. Leo, oh my God. I had no idea they were going to do this. I told them to leave you alone. I tried to protect you, sweet boy. You know I love you. Victor let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He tapped the screen of his tablet. The audio filled the foyer crystal clear. It was a recording of a phone call. Beatrice's voice. Arthur, listen to me. The kid is weak. He's soft. Just corner him at the house, threaten to cut him off entirely, and he will crack. Just make sure when he signs over the $7 billion, my trust fund gets bumped up by $50 million. I'm playing the sweet aunt routine right now, but I want my cut. The audio cut off. The silence that followed was suffocating. Beatrice's mouth hung open in silent horror. She looked at me, completely exposed, her mask utterly destroyed. You were the one who told them to throw me out into the street, I said quietly, looking at her with nothing but pure disgust. You sold me out for a bump in your trust fund. You are just as rotten as they are. But we were not done. We were not even close to done. That covers the corporate extortion and the psychological manipulation, Police Chief Reynolds said, stepping forward, resting his heavy hands on his utility belt. But that is not why I am here this morning, Arthur. My father swallowed hard, sweat practically pouring down his forehead despite the freezing air coming through the open door. Chief Reynolds, I can explain whatever. Thomas? I interrupted, my voice sharp. Show them. Thomas walked over to the wall near the grand staircase and pressed a hidden panel. A large, high-definition security monitor slid out from behind a painting. Thomas pressed a button on a remote. The screen flickered to life. The footage was in pristine, night vision black and white, complete with a timestamp in the bottom corner. It was dated the exact night of my grandfather's funeral, at 3 in the morning. The camera angle was from the upper corner of my grandfather's private study. On the screen, 3 figures crept into the room. It was my father, my mother, and Julian. They were holding heavy canvas duffel bags. We all stood in silence as we watched my father forcefully pry open the antique mahogany desk with a crowbar. We watched my mother eagerly stuff my grandmother's diamond brooches, vintage Rolex watches, and heavy gold bars into her designer purse. We watched Julian crack the wall safe and empty out stacks of bearer bonds and classified corporate documents. They were looting the estate like common street criminals, stealing millions of dollars in untraceable assets just hours after putting the man who earned them into the ground. My mother let out a horrific, guttural gasp, covering her mouth with both hands as she watched herself on the screen. Julian backed up until his spine hit the front door, looking like he was going to vomit on his own shoes. Theft of an estate, breaking and entering, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit corporate fraud. Chief Reynolds listed off, his voice echoing loudly in the foyer. We have the high-definition video. We have the digital footprint. We have the logs of the gate codes you used to sneak in. You are looking at a minimum of 15 to 20 years in federal prison, Arthur. My father's knees physically buckled. He collapsed onto the marble floor, the incredibly powerful, ruthless CEO reduced to a trembling, broken shell of a man. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute terror, tears finally spilling down his face. "Leo, please," Arthur begged, his voice cracking, raising a trembling hand toward me. "Please, son. I'm your father. She's your mother. We are family. You can't send us to prison. Please, I will do anything. We will leave the state. We will give you everything. Just please, don't let them arrest us." My mother fell to her knees right next to him, sobbing hysterically, completely ruining her expensive makeup. "Leo, my baby, I'm so sorry. We were grieving. We weren't thinking straight. Please, you have a good heart. Don't do this to your family." I stood above them, looking down at the people who had made my entire life a living hell. The people who had mocked my passions, isolated me, thrown me out into the freezing night, and tried to steal the only good thing I had ever been given. I looked at their tears, and for the first time in my 28 years of life, I felt absolutely nothing for them. No anger, no pity, just a profound, heavy emptiness. "Family is forever," I whispered, repeating the exact words my mother had spat at me when she threw me out of her house. "Isn't that what you told me, Eleanor? But you see, my family died in a car crash 6 weeks ago. You people are just strangers trespassing in his house." I looked up at Chief Reynolds. "Chief, they are all yours. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Now let's finish this." As the officers stepped forward, pulling the heavy steel handcuffs from their belts, the reality of the situation finally crashed down on Julian. He panicked. He shoved past my mother, threw the front doors wide open, and sprinted toward his Porsche. He didn't even make it down the steps before 2 more plainclothes officers tackled him directly into the frozen gravel, pinning his arms behind his back. My father didn't fight. He just knelt on the floor, weeping openly, his wrists clicked into iron cuffs. My mother screamed my name over and over again as she was dragged out the door, her mink coat dragging on the ground. Aunt Beatrice stood completely frozen in the corner, sobbing silently as Victor handed her a legal restraining order, banning her from coming within 500 feet of me or the corporation ever again. I stood in the doorway, watching the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminate the heavy fog as they drove my blood relatives away. The massive iron gates closed slowly behind them with a heavy, final clang. The war was over, and I had won. But as the flashing lights disappeared into the morning fog, the absolute, crushing weight of everything that had happened finally hit my chest. I turned around, looking at the massive, empty foyer, and I finally let myself breathe. The silence that fell over the estate after the police cruisers vanished down the winding road was absolute. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of fear that I had grown up with. It was the clean, clear silence of a storm that had finally broken. I closed the heavy oak doors, the thick metal latches sliding into place with a satisfying, permanent click. I stood in the center of the foyer for a long time, just staring at the exact spot on the marble floor where my father had fallen to his knees and begged for mercy. My chest heaved, my breath coming out in shaky, ragged gasps. I felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of exhaustion crash over me, so intense my knees actually threatened to give out. Suddenly, a warm, steady hand clamped firmly onto my shoulder. It was Victor. "You held the line, Leo," Victor said quietly, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Your grandfather knew you had that kind of steel inside you. He just needed you to realize it yourself." Thomas appeared beside me holding a glass of water, his posture slightly more relaxed than it had been in weeks. "The perimeter is entirely secure, sir. The estate belongs strictly to you now. They will never set foot on this property again." I took the water, my hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline slowly drained from my system. I looked around the room at Victor, Thomas, Elena, and Sarah. They had risked their own professional reputations and personal safety to stand between me and a family of corporate predators. They weren't just employees or lawyers. They were the shield my grandfather had forged for me. "Thank you," I managed to whisper, my voice cracking. "All of you." The days that followed were a chaotic, exhausting blur of high-level legal briefings, corporate takeovers, and intense media scrutiny. The news of Arthur Sterling's arrest for grand larceny and corporate extortion hit the financial news networks like a localized earthquake. The Sterling Corporation's stock took a temporary dip, but Elena and I were ruthlessly prepared. We executed a flawless transition of power. During my very first board meeting as the majority shareholder, sitting in the massive leather chair at the head of the glass table, I looked at the executives who had enabled my father for decades. I didn't yell. I didn't pound my fists. I simply fired every single board member who had turned a blind eye to Arthur's unethical practices, replacing them with a diverse coalition of innovative, hungry leaders that Elena had personally vetted. The downfall of my blood family was swift, absolute, and entirely self-inflicted. I didn't have to lift a finger to destroy them. The justice system and their own catastrophic financial debt did the heavy lifting. 6 months passed, and the dust finally began to settle. I was sitting in my grandfather's study, reviewing a stack of philanthropic grants, when Victor walked in, dropping a thick manila folder onto my desk. "The final updates on the criminal and civil proceedings," Victor announced, taking a seat opposite me. "I thought you might want closure." I leaned back in the leather chair, staring at the folder. "Give me the summary, Victor. I don't want to read their names." Victor nodded, opening the file. "Your father, Arthur, accepted a plea deal to avoid a highly publicized, embarrassing trial. He pled guilty to grand larceny, corporate fraud, and extortion. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison in a minimum security facility. His personal assets, the ones not tied to the corporation, were liquidated to pay massive IRS fines. I felt a strange twinge in my chest, not of sadness, but of profound pity. The man who had terrorized me, who thought he was a god among men, was now just an inmate with a number, stripped of his suits and his Rolexes. "And my mother?" I asked quietly. "Eleanor avoided jail time by cooperating with the authorities and testifying against Arthur," Victor replied, a hint of disgust in his voice. "However, the scandal completely ruined her socially. She was formally expelled from the country club, ousted from every charity board, and she was forced to sell the mansion to cover her mounting legal fees. She is currently living in a heavily downsized 2-bedroom condo in a completely different state. She has attempted to contact you via mail 14 times. I have intercepted and destroyed every letter, as instructed." "Keep destroying them," I said without hesitation. "What about Julian?" Victor almost smiled. "Julian is bankrupt. The venture capitalists he defrauded aggressively sued him into oblivion. His tech startup was dissolved and all of his assets were seized. Last week, repo men physically towed his silver Porsche out of a grocery store parking lot. He is currently facing separate wire fraud charges and is working a minimum wage data entry job to pay for a public defender." Karma had come for them, not as an abstract concept, but as a heavily documented legal reality. They had worshipped money their entire lives, sacrificing their own son on the altar of greed. And in the end, it was their absolute obsession with money that left them completely destitute and isolated. I closed the folder and slid it back across the desk to Victor. "That's it, then. The book is closed." "It is," Victor agreed gently. "They are your past, Leo. Now, what are you going to do with your future?" I looked out the massive window of the study, watching the afternoon sun cast golden light over the sprawling green lawns of the estate. I had survived the storm. The villains had been vanquished. But I knew that true victory wasn't just about watching my abusers fall. It was about what I chose to build on the empty ground they left behind. It was a crisp, beautifully bright Sunday afternoon in late October. The sprawling gardens of the estate were exploding with the deep reds and vibrant golds of autumn. Inside the mansion, the heavy, suffocating silence that used to haunt the halls was completely gone. In its place was the warm, chaotic sound of laughter, clinking silverware, and genuine joy. I was hosting Sunday dinner in the grand dining room. But the people sitting around the massive oak table weren't my blood relatives. They were the people who had chosen to stand by me when I had absolutely nothing. Thomas was sitting at the far end, officially off the clock, sipping a glass of expensive red wine and telling a hilarious story about a time my grandfather accidentally set off the security alarms trying to sneak into his own kitchen for midnight ice cream. Sarah, the head chef, was laughing so hard she had tears in her eyes, proudly passing around massive plates of roasted chicken and fresh vegetables. Victor was sitting next to Elena, deeply engaged in a friendly debate about corporate tax law, though both of them were smiling. I sat at the head of the table, looking at these brilliant, loyal, inherently good people. This was my family. I had finally learned the hardest lesson of my life. Blood makes you related, but loyalty, respect, and unconditional support make you a family. I didn't need to share DNA with these people to know that if the world ended tomorrow, they would be right by my side. A toast, I said, standing up and raising my glass of sparkling cider. The room immediately quieted down, everyone turning to look at me with warm, expectant eyes. To Winston Sterling, I said, my voice steady and full of profound gratitude. A man who knew that true wealth isn't measured by what you keep in a bank vault, but by the people you keep in your life. And to all of you for proving him right, thank you for being my family. To Winston, they echoed in unison, raising their glasses, the crystal chiming beautifully in the warm, softly lit room. The next morning, I drove out to the private cemetery on the edge of the city. I didn't take a sports car or a luxury SUV. I drove my old, rattling Honda Civic. I kept it as a daily reminder of exactly where I came from and how quickly everything can change. I walked along the manicured stone paths until I reached my grandfather's grave. The marble headstone was simple, elegant, and completely unpretentious, exactly how he lived his life. I knelt on the damp grass and placed a large bouquet of fresh white lilies, his absolute favorite flower, against the base of the stone. I sat there in the quiet morning air, listening to the wind rustle through the ancient oak trees. "Hi, Grandpa," I whispered, tracing the engraved letters of his name with my fingertips. "We did it. The company is completely secure." Elena and I officially launched the Winston Sterling Foundation for Arts and Education yesterday. We took $2 billion of the liquid assets and placed it into an irrevocable trust. We are fully funding music and arts programs in underfunded public schools across the entire state. We are buying instruments for kids who can't afford them, paying salaries for teachers who are struggling, and building concert halls in neighborhoods that need a safe place. I felt a hot tear slip down my cheek, but it wasn't a tear of grief. It was a tear of profound, overwhelming peace. "You were right, Grandpa," I continued, my voice breaking slightly. "Money can buy a piano, but it can't buy the soul. You protected my soul. You gave me the armor I needed to fight them off. They tried to break me, but they failed. I am safe now. We are all safe." A gentle gust of wind swept across the cemetery, rustling the leaves and carrying the sweet scent of the white lilies into the air. I closed my eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over my face, and for a fleeting, beautiful moment, I swear I could feel him sitting right there next to me, bumping his shoulder against mine on the piano bench. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in brilliant shades of purple and gold, I sat alone in the grand foyer of the mansion. The house was quiet, but it was a comfortable, comforting silence. I sat down on the leather bench of my grandfather's antique Steinway grand piano. I opened the heavy wooden lid, exposing the pristine ivory keys. I didn't have any sheet music in front of me. I didn't need it. I raised my hands, hovered them over the keys for a brief moment, and then I began to play. I played a piece I had composed myself, right there in my tiny, cramped apartment years ago. But this time it didn't sound small or desperate. The music swelled, echoing magnificently off the high marble walls, filling every single empty corner of the massive estate with life, passion, and undeniable strength. It was a song of survival. It was a song of victory. It was the sound of a man who had finally claimed his rightful place in the world. I had lost my blood relatives, but I had gained my entire life. And as the final, powerful chord resonated into the night, I knew with absolute certainty that no one would ever be able to silence my music again. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If there is one thing I want you to take away from this, it is that your worth is not defined by the toxic people who happen to share your DNA. Never let anyone, especially family, use guilt or manipulation to steal your peace or your boundaries. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect yourself from the people who were supposed to love you? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Stay strong and protect your peace.